about the Orange One's activities, and come through all of this, I think, with a shining reputation and an ever more sort of bright star as a public speaker, as an author and a writer, and I think a public intellectual. So my sense of what a privilege it is, and I see Alar Oljum there in the audience before me. You were a colleague once for a while as well. We once had an Estonian colleague for a year. And there are a couple of other colleagues here. There's Tara Valma. Can't see you, but there you are. We're in pink over there. So it's wonderful to have such a representation here. All I can say is that during the reign of the Orange One, a lot of European governments were very, very glad to have in the office of the Senior Director for Europe and Russia and to Deputy Julia, shall we say, a last resort of sanity. And I know this as a fact because I've been told that. But what I really want to say is that Fiona is an example of something else, something which was sort of brought to the movies in one of my favorite movies, A Matter of Life and Death by Paul and Pressburger, 1946. If you've never seen it, watch it. It is a wonderful movie. And there's a great scene in there. Don't worry, this is not becoming a synopsis of the movie. But it is, in the end, a celebration of how Europeans and people from even farther away than Europe become Americans and yet remain themselves. And Fiona is one of those people, born in Bishop Auckland, grown up in the northeast of England, studied in St. Andrews and then at Harvard, and has become an American with deep and warm roots in Britain and in Europe, a profound expert on Russia and the post-Soviet space. And I think that not just America, but also Europe is lucky to have her as a wanderer between the worlds. With that, I'm shutting up and handing the podium over to Fiona. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Constance. I wasn't quite expecting that introduction. And it's a great honour to be with so many people who I admire here. I think actually everybody in this room, just such an honour to be with all of you colleagues and people I've been meeting for the first time during the last day or so. I have to apologise, and I just hope I will not do what I'm fearing I will do, but I caught a cold in Berlin, and actually Susan Glasser and Sylvia Chattel, who are here too, we caught it from the same person, who actually isn't at this conference, but I apologise in advance for anybody I might have transmitted it onto. I promise it wasn't COVID, because I've tested several times, but I do apologise if we're now passing on the cold. But hopefully this will not mar your participation in this absolutely fabulous conference. I also just want to say before I started that the last time I was here at the Lennart Meri conference, I was here with Vladimir Kara-Murza and also David Kramer, and we were on a panel. And I just want all of us to pause for a moment to think about what's happened to Vladimir in the time. I mean, in fact, I went on the old historic Tallinn tour with him, and remember, very fondly and very vividly of standing, talking to him, and I could never have imagined that he'd be in some other place right now. And it's people like Vladimir Kara-Murza and all of our other colleagues who, are also suffering very much for this and standing up for their own convictions. I want to, so it's for Vladimir and all the other people as well. I've been asked to try to frame some of the issues that we've been talking about here at the event, and eventually this will be put online by Eva and her colleagues. I've got a couple of titles for this. We can make them up later. We've got plenty of journalists who actually would come up with much better titles, as they tend to do in the audience. But to talk about Ukraine in the New World Disorder, or as I've also titled it, The Rest's Rebellion Against the United States. And we heard quite a lot about that last night, I think, in the Night Owl panel. So anyway, this is a lecture, so bear with me. And if you need to go out and get coffee to be able to get all the way through this, please do. I will not be offended. And I'll just start to begin on this then. So more than a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the brutal war that Vladimir Putin has ignited has also transformed, as major regional conflicts often do, into a war with global ramifications. But this has not, as Vladimir Putin and others claim, become a proxy war between the United States or the collective West, that's the US and its European and other allies, against Russia. In the current geopolitical arena, the war is now effectively the reverse. And this might be a bit controversial, but I'm going to suggest that the war has become a proxy for a rebellion by Russia and the rest against the United States. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I mean here. And the war in Ukraine is perhaps the event that makes the passing of Pax Americana apparent to everyone. In its pursuit of the war, Russia has cleverly exploited deep-seated international resistance and, in some cases, open challenges to continued American leadership of global institutions. It's not just Russia that seeks to push the United States to the sidelines in Europe, and China that wants to minimize and contain US military and economic presence in Asia, so both can secure their respective spheres of influence. But there's other countries that traditionally, from the European perspective, we've considered middle powers or swing states, the so-called rest of the world, that would also like to see the United States cut down to a different size in their neighborhoods and exert more influence over global affairs. They want to decide, not be told what's in their interest. So in short, in 2023, we hear resounding no to US domination and see a marked appetite elsewhere in the world for a world without a hegemon. In this context, I would argue, and I think it's already been argued in several of the panels over the last day, that the next iteration of the global security, political, and economic system will not be framed by the United States alone. The reality is already something else. It's not even an order, which inherently points to a hierarchy, and perhaps it's not even a disorder, even though I had that in the original title. Because a range of countries are pushing and pulling in line with their own priorities to produce new arrangements. So we, in the transatlantic community, may need to develop some new terminology, as well as adapt our foreign policy approaches to deal with what was likely to be horizontal networks of overlapping and sometimes competing structures. We've entered what Simir Saran, who many of you here may know, the president of India's Observer Research Foundation, has dubbed the age of limited liability partnerships. The regionalization of security, trade, and political alliances will complicate our national security strategies and our policy planning. But actually, if we step back and think about it, it may also intersect with our priorities in useful ways if we can be flexible and creative, rather than simply resisting and responding when things go in directions we don't like. As British security expert Neil Melvin has suggested, someone who I think is known to many people here, but sadly isn't here right now, we should embrace the idea of minilateralism. Now, Lennart Meri, whom we celebrate and commemorate with this conference, demonstrated just this kind of flexibility that I'm thinking about here, as well as his creativity at a similarly disruptive juncture at the end of the Cold War, just as one might expect from someone who was a talented polyglot, a writer and a filmmaker, and who as politician served as both foreign minister and as president. And in fact, we might even suggest that Lennart Meri prefigured our present moment. Because in the 1990s, President Meri promoted the idea that becoming a European or being a transatlanticist didn't actually mean you had to shed your distinctive Estonian identity or discount your specific regional context. And as a trained historian, he understood that context to its deepest core. So President Meri set out to develop multiple regional and global perspectives for Estonia. He prioritized relations with immediate neighbors in Europe, with the United States and the United Nations. And of course, relations with the United States were critical for Meri because Washington never acknowledged the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states after World War II and facilitated the freedom of Estonia after 1991. But Meri also took a staunchly Baltic approach in his elaboration of Estonia's policy. He never subordinated Estonia in any way to a larger power. And he had a keen appreciation of what a small country could achieve and why. And as he noted in a famous comment, reflecting on Estonia's obvious proximity to and history with Russia that we've also been hearing about, compared to Russia, Estonia is like an Inuit kayak. A supertanker takes 16 nautical miles to turn around, but the Inuit can do a 180-degree turn on a dime. I was thinking that last night at the dinner. You probably were too, these huge cruise lines outside, and wondering if I could see Lennart Meri's kayak somewhere, going off there in the distance. And if he were here today, I suspect President Meri would recognize that the war in Ukraine is a world or system-changing war. Again, something we've been hearing about. Because it stripped away the surface detail and exposed the flaws and the fault lines in the international order. But first of all, we also have to recognize that this is not a 21st century conflict. It's a retrograde war. That's what we just heard on the last panel. And it's what we hope will be the terminal spasm of the European convulsions that have shaken the rest of the world throughout the 20th century because of Europe's previous mercantilist dominance and imperial conquests. As we've already heard several times, Putin and Moscow are fighting in Ukraine to regain control of a former colonial territory relinquished at the end of the 20th century. Putin, of course, believes that Russia is not just the successor state to, but the state in continuum of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And indeed, this is how we all recognized Russia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991. So honestly, this is on us as well. This fact explains a great deal about the present, because Russia is the last continental empire in Europe. I'm going to put the UK to the side because it's kind of off in the sea somewhere. So the last continental empire here in Europe. Over the course of the 20th century, the First World War brought down, of course, the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires, along with the German Kaiser and the Russian Tsar. But the Bolsheviks reconstituted Russia as the Soviet Union, and they forcibly held on to many of Moscow's contiguous territorial possessions. The Second World War marked the end of European colonialism and spurred the disintegration of the British Empire, overseas that is. But the Soviet Union actually expanded again, as we know from here. Indeed, of course, as we all know, the USSR retook Estonia and the other Baltic states and tried to retake Finland. So the Soviets also, at that same time, exerted new dominion over Eastern Europe after World War II. And then that expansionary zeal of the Soviet Union brought it into almost half a century of confrontation with the United States, which I think we often forget was a former British colony. That's kind of an interesting twist in history there. The Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, finally collapsed at the end of this period, the Cold War, but not in the minds of Vladimir Putin and his cohort, again, as we've just been hearing in all the panels. Now, since 1991, the United States has seemingly stood alone as the global superpower, but I would argue that today, after a fraught two-decade period shaped by American-led military interventions and direct engagement in regional wars, the Ukraine war highlights the decline of the United States itself. Now, this decline is relative, of course, economically and militarily, but it is very serious in terms of US moral authority. And again, we've heard quite a lot about that as well. Unfortunately, just as Osama bin Laden intended, the US's own reactions and actions have eroded its position since the devastating terrorist attacks of 9/11. America fatigue, and we actually heard about that last night on the panel, as you might recall. I'd already had that in my notes, and then we heard one of our panelists actually say it. America fatigue and disillusionment with its role as the global hegemon is widespread. And this, I would argue, also includes in the United States itself, a fact that we frequently see on display in Congress, news outlets, and in think tank debates. For some, the US is a flawed international actor with its own domestic problems it should be attending to. And for others, the US is still a new form of imperial state that ignores the concerns of others and throws its military weight around. Well, why am I saying all this? Because in the near term, this is particularly detrimental for Ukraine. And I think we've heard a lot about that over the last year. Because globally, the war in Ukraine is viewed as one in a long series of dramatic events since 2001, driven by the United States. America's heavy-handed conduct of the war on terror alienated the vast swathe of the Muslim world. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003, hot on the heels of Afghanistan, revived the horrors of US Cold War interventions in Korea and Vietnam. US inaction in conflicts like Yemen and selective interventions in Libya and Syria underscored US foreign policy inconsistency. I'm relating to you all the things that I've been hearing myself over this last year from all kinds of interlocutors. The 2008 to 2010 financial crisis and Great Recession, followed by America's domestic upheaval and the election of Donald Trump in 2016, I noticed that Constanta couldn't even say his name, all dimmed the power of America's democratic example. Trump's contempt for international agreements and his flagrant mishandling of the global pandemic, as well as more recently the Biden administration's botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, have all cast doubt on the US capacity for global leadership. Now, stepping back, and again thinking about what we've heard on previous panels, none of this means that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is viewed positively. The central tenets of international law are still a universal order or ordering principle, especially for smaller states, and we've heard that said as well. Countries across the globe have broadly acknowledged and condemned the facts of Russia's aggression, including in multiple votes in the United Nations General Assembly. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and all kinds of other international rulings have emphasized that Ukraine has the legal, not just the moral high ground in this war. And furthermore, Moscow's brutal conduct, its atrocities, alongside its military blunders and failures, have also diminished Russia's standing. But how most states and commentators feel about the United States is the prism that they take for assessing Russia's actions. And I think all of us have been talking about that in the last day or so. Because Ukraine is essentially being punished by guilt through association for having direct US support in its effort to defend itself and liberate its territory. And indeed, in some international and American domestic forums, many of which we've all probably been participating in, discussions about Ukraine very quickly degenerate into arguments about US past behavior. Russia's actions are addressed in a perfunctory fashion. Russia's only doing what the United States does, is the retort. Yes, Russia overturned the fundamental post-1945 principle of the prohibition against war and the use of force enshrined in Article 2 of the UN Charter, but the US already damaged this principle when it invaded Iraq 20 years ago. This is verbatim from an email I got recently from someone. Whataboutism is not just a feature of Russian rhetoric. The US invasion of Iraq is universally seen to have undercut US credibility, and it continues to do so. And of course, it's been referenced in passing here as well. So for many critics of the United States, Iraq was the most recent in a series of American sins, stretching back to Vietnam, and the precursor of current events. Again, even though a tiny handful of states have sided with Russia in all these successive UN resolutions in the General Assembly, significant abstentions, including by China and India, often rather than not, signal displeasure with the United States. And so as a result, the vital twin tasks of restoring the prohibition against war and the use of force as a critical cornerstone of the United Nations and international system, and of defending Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, all get lost all the time in a morass of skepticism and suspicion about the United States. So I want to talk about this for a bit more because I think it then will lead us to some thinking about how we can actually address this. And in several of the panels I've heard, well, okay, great, all this analysis, but where are some prescriptions? And I'll try to come to that at the end of the presentation. So in the so-called global south, and what I'm loosely referring to as the rest of the world, there's no sense of the US as a virtuous state. Perceptions of American hubris and hypocrisy are widespread. Again, we've heard about this. Trust in the international systems that the US helped invent and has presided over since World War II is long gone. And elites and populations in many of these countries believe that the system was imposed on them at a time of weakness when they were only just securing their independence. So even if elites and populations have generally benefited from Pax Americana, they seem to believe that the United States and what they call its bloc of countries in the collective West have benefited far more. So for them, this war is still about protecting the West's benefit and hegemony and not defending Ukraine. So Russian false narratives about its invasion of Ukraine and about the US resonate and take root globally because they fall on all this fertile soil. Russia's disinformation to many of the people that I've been talking to, and again, we've heard some of our other commentators mentioning this as well, for people outside of Europe and the United States, it seems more like information. It comports with the facts as they see them. So a lot of non-Western elites, not all, but a lot of them, share the same belief as some Western analysts that Russia was provoked or pushed into this war by the United States and by NATO expansion. They resent the power of the US dollar and Washington's use of financial sanctions. They say they weren't consulted by the US on this round of sanctions against Russia. They see Western sanctions constraining their energy and food supplies and pushing up prices. And they blame Russia's Black Sea blockade and deliberate disruption of global grain exports on the United States, not on the actual perpetrator, Vladimir Putin. And they point out that no one pushed to sanction the United States when it invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, even though they were opposed to US intervention, so why should they step up now? So what I'm relating here is basically a summary of all kinds of discussions that I and many of my colleagues at Brookings, Constanza and others have been taking part in over the course of this last year by the war. So this, I just wanted to put it all together and to relate to here about the problem that we're dealing with here. Because a lot of countries in the global south, their resistance to the United States and European appeals for solidarity on Ukraine have become a kind of an open rebellion. This is a mutiny against what they see as the collective West dominating the international discourse and foisting its problems on everyone else, while brushing aside their priorities on climate change compensation, economic development, and debt relief. They feel constantly marginalized in world affairs. And in fact, several people have said, well, why are we labeled, as I'm actually reflecting this as a speech, the global south? You know, we were previously called the third world or the developing world. Why are we even the rest of the world? You know, they are the world. 6.5 billion people. For them, our terminology is reeking of colonialism. And so I would argue that at this particular juncture, the Cold War era non-aligned movement has re-emerged, if in fact it ever went away. But at present, this is less of a cohesive movement than a desire for distance, to be left out of what a lot of people have been talking to us about, the European mess around Ukraine. I mean, it's hard to hear all of this, but this is what we're contending with. But within all of this, there's another thing that I want to mention here, because there's also a very clear negative reaction to the American propensity for defining the global order and forcing countries to take sides. As one Indian interlocutor recently exclaimed to us about Ukraine, this is your conflict. We have other pressing matters, our own issues. We're in our own lands on our own sides. Where are you when things go wrong for us? I think we heard a little bit about that last night as well. So most countries, including many here in Europe, reject the current US framing of a new great power competition, a geopolitical tug-of-war between the United States and China. States and elites bristle at the US idea that you're either with us or against us, or you're on the wrong or the right side of history in an epic struggle of democracies versus autocracies. And few outside of Europe have accepted this definition of the war in Ukraine or the geopolitical stakes. They don't want to be assigned to new blocs that are artificially imposed, and no one wants to be caught in a future titanic clash between the United States and China. In contrast to the United States, as well as some other countries that we can all think of, Japan, South Korea, and also India, most countries do not see China as a direct military or security threat. They may have some very serious qualms about China's rough economic and political behavior and its blatant abuse of human rights, but they still see China as a valuable trade and investment partner for their future development. They don't see the United States and the European Union as offering sufficient alternatives to turn away from China, including in the security realm. And even within Europe, I think we all know and are very well aware of this, that the sense of how much is at stake for individual countries in the larger international system and in relations with China also varies quite considerably. Outside of Europe, excuse me, there goes the voice. Oh, I hope you haven't got my cold already. No, okay, good, sorry. So outside of Europe, the interest in new regional orders is much more pronounced than I might even think. And in this context, and I'd like to just talk about this for a moment, the BRICS is really now emerging as a very attractive alternative for its members and also for others to the G7 and the G20. We talked a lot about different groupings here, and I think it's actually worth pausing for a moment on the BRICS, because they just had a summit in April, just basically a month ago, and it was also announced there that 19 countries, including Saudi Arabia and Iran, are interested in joining the organization. So countries see the BRICS and also other entities that we wouldn't really think about, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or the SCO, as offering flexible diplomatic arrangements, possible new strategic alliances, and different trade opportunities beyond the United States and Europe. Now, that being said, BRICS members and aspirants have very disparate interests, and I think we need to consider these as we look ahead to finding a resolution of the war in Ukraine, and as we kind of consider the structures and networks we're going to have to deal with in the future. And if I'm going on too long with just discussing some of this, I would like Eva and Constanda to give me the signal, the universal signal of please hurry up. So I'm going to run through some factors that are relevant to thinking about Ukraine in the BRICS context. And again, because I do think that the BRICS deserves a lot more attention. I know a lot of people here are thinking about this. Now, from the Russian perspective, obviously, Putin's hoping that the war has undermined the 1945 global equation. Moscow hopes to emerge from the war and focus on expanding its role and influence in multilateral organizations like the BRICS, from which the United States and the collective West are for now excluded. But it's also worth noting that inside the BRICS grouping, precisely because of the war, Russia's seen as increasingly reliant on China and much less of an independent global player. And that's something that's really changed over the last year. China obviously clearly dominates the BRICS, and wants to use the organization to consolidate its regional and global positions. And Beijing sees the US as the enemy of its ambitions and Moscow as an important counterweight to Washington. But China does not support Russia's aggression against Ukraine. However, US security framing, including the frequent invocations of Taiwan and China is watching Ukraine in the US Congress and elsewhere, raises concerns in Beijing that Washington sees the Ukraine war as a test run for a clash with China. Brazil, the first B in the BRICS, values China as a counterweight to the United States. And as one Brazilian interlocutor told a group of us recently during one of our think tank exchanges, Brazil is condemned to exist on a continent dominated by the United States. Most of our jaws dropped. That was the opening line of the presentation. And as in China, heated American rhetoric about the war in Ukraine has shaped the perceptions of the conflict in Brazil. Some Brazilian elites and officials view the war in Ukraine as the first proxy war in the 21st century between the United States and China. For them, Russia's already subordinate to China and weakened as an actor beyond its neighbourhood. That was a bit of a surprise from these past discussions. India, of course, wants to play a larger role in the Indian Ocean, but unlike Brazil, it sees China as a genuine security threat, especially in the Himalayas, where the two countries have clashed over territory, and we heard a bit again about that last night. And for New Delhi, Washington is very fickle as a source of support, where Moscow has been a long-time supplier of arms and ammunition. So India fears Russia's new dependency on China, and of all the BRIC members, India is probably in the most difficult policy predicament, because it wants to keep tabs on what China and Russia are doing with each other within the BRICS, but it also still wants to maintain relations with the US and with everyone else as well. Now, South Africa is quite tricky, on the other hand, because we've had a lot about South Africa in the last few days, and it wants to develop its relations with both China and Russia in the BRICS. And for South Africa, China is a source of investment and development assistance, while Russia is very clearly, for South Africa, the continuation of the USSR, which was decisive in helping the African National Congress fight apartheid during the Cold War. And we've heard many times that the ANC views the United States as the new imperial power and rejects what it sees as America's demonization of Russia in the Ukraine war. Now, I'm just going to talk very quickly about Saudi Arabia and Iran as two of the aspirants, keeping an eye on the time here. Because Saudi Arabia, among the BRICS aspirants, sees US power fading in the Middle East after its military withdrawals from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And in seeking to join the BRICS, Saudi Arabia wants to take advantage of all these new shifts in global power and trade. China's become the key importer of Middle East oil. It's a significant regional investor, and it's the recent mediator, of course, in Saudi Arabia's relations with Iran and Yemen. And for the Saudis, Russia is a factor in the Middle East. Russia is a Middle East player. It's not just because of Syria, but it's there in energy calculations. And there's a whole host of new economic opportunities that are opening up because so many Russian businesses are moving their money and activities to the Gulf region to avoid Western sanctions. Now, Iran, on the other hand, all very different. It's desperately seeking economic relief. It sees an opportunity through the BRICS to change its regional pariah status and build on recent Chinese-brokered rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. But Tehran believes that the war in Ukraine has undermined Europe as an independent source of power and resubordinated Europe to Washington. And on top of that, Iran then senses US weakness ahead of the 2024 American presidential elections and the chance to play a completely different international game. So that's partly why we see Iran already providing weapons to Russia to use against Ukraine. So again, we've got some very disparate views here. And I think given the fact that we've got so many agendas and aspirations centered on just one of these alternative global orders, managing the war in Ukraine, as well as all the other high-stake issues that we've got to deal with, from climate change, future pandemics, and nuclear non-proliferation, of course, becomes extremely difficult unless we start to think differently about the challenge that we're dealing with. And again, this is essential for Ukraine, because Ukraine's long-term prospects depend on broader global dynamics and the goodwill of other countries, including all these BRICS members, not just on the military, political, and economic support of the United States and Europe, no matter how vital that is. Because of its size and location, Ukraine's a multi-regional state. Its security will be defined by what Neil Melvin has been promoting as this idea of minilateralism, because Ukraine is going to have to consolidate its existing relationships with the United States, The European Union and NATO, as well as its neighbours in Central and Eastern Europe, close partners here in the Baltic states, the Scandinavian countries, the UK and in the Black Sea region. The G7 and the G20 groupings are going to be critical. And all of this means that the persistently negative views of the United States will complicate Ukraine's foreign policy. What will happen, for example, if China shocks us, and along with Iran, and we suspect North Korea, provides weapons to Russia based on enmity with the United States? I mean, that's something that we do have to contemplate and keep working on. And then, unfortunately, there's NATO, which we've been just talking about in the last couple of panels. And as a direct consequence of the war and Finland and Sweden joining, of course the alliance has become the major driver of Ukrainian and European security. And at least for the duration of the conflict, the ongoing debates about European strategic autonomy have taken something of a back seat. Europe's jolted back to the kind of reliance it had on US military power from 1945 to 1989. And this is another challenge that I want us to think about. Because again, outside of Europe and the transatlantic arena, NATO has an image problem that Putin exploits. Perceptions, as we know, are often much more important in international affairs than reality. And we heard about that in the panel, perceptions of the past as prologue, all of these narratives that we have out there that we have to contend with. And since the end of the Cold War, Putin has persisted in portraying NATO as an extension of the United States militarily and as an inherently anti-Russian institution. Unlike Gorbachev and Yeltsin, Putin has never seriously sought an accommodation with NATO. And for Putin, the US is still the Cold War adversary. He says this every day, so I mean, I'm not making anything up here. And NATO is still a provocation for simply still being around. And Putin has actively fueled China's concerns that the US is expanding NATO-like structures to Asia. And he's fed the idea that NATO expansion is the proximate cause of the war in Ukraine. And that's both inside and outside of Europe. I mean, basically, Putin wants the US and NATO gone for good in his neighborhood. So all of this means, and I'm coming to the end of my remarks here, that we need a diplomatic surge. And all of us here can play some part in this. We need a skillful and patient effort alongside the vital military track, which I think the vast majority of us here still think is essential in the near to even the longer term. We need this diplomatic surge to help end Russia's brutal and senseless war, because Ukraine needs broad-based global support. So we have to push back against Putin's disinformation and all of these anti-US and anti-NATO narratives. The United States and Europe will have to engage the rest of the world in an honest conversation about the stakes of this war. And as many people have already said here, we're going to have to actively listen to their feedback and concerns on specific issues. Even if, frankly, we don't really like what we're hearing. And I've been relating, rather a lot of what we at Brookings and our colleagues here have been hearing, because we have been trying to listen and engaging in dialogue. And Angela Stent is here somewhere and has a very interesting project that, hopefully she'll be able to tell, some of you about that some of this information is coming from. Given all of the disparate views and agendas, we're also probably going to have to take a piecemeal and more transactional approach to what we're doing here, to be able to identify areas where we can make common cause with other states, as well as with international and private sector actors. Now, there is one piece of good news, although it makes things a bit complicated here, because the Global South does still see, and I should stop calling them the Global South, we're going to have to, again, better terminology here, does still see the United Nations as a very credible and important actor. But most countries want to downgrade the exclusive power of the Security Council and boost the activities of the General Assembly to develop new mechanisms, including for genuinely tackling climate change and economic development. But as the UN still has relevance and universal acceptance as an actor, then we should really consider how we can address all of these issues in that context at the same time that we try to address Ukraine. So where can we work with the UN to provide technical assistance, mediation and coordination for Ukraine? For example, can the UNGA balance the UNSC and constrain the Russian and Chinese vetoes in some way? And we should also ask ourselves if this is possible for a larger role to be played by the ICJ and the ICC. And I say that because South Africa made an interesting recent decision to stay in the ICC, not pull out as they were contemplating, it seemed, at one point, and actually to suggest to Putin that he not attend the upcoming BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August so they don't have to detain him in line with the March arrest warrant from the ICC. So that's actually an interesting point. I mean, we have to look for points like this to see whether there's something that we can actually do. I would also say, how can we build on the UN crisis interventions like the International Atomic Energy Agency's effort to secure the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine? That's actually been a very important effort where a lot of people have been involved. And the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Let's try to think about how we could turn these into durable long-term solutions, but in partnership with other countries outside of Europe and the United States. And then finally, if the United States is the prism for everyone for Ukraine, and this is, as I have argued, has become a kind of proxy rebellion against the United States, what alternative actors could be brought into this who could gain traction to restore peace through collective action? All eyes are currently on China, but India has historical goodwill in multiple regional contexts and might help break common ground with others. So do countries like Kenya in Africa, and I think many of us will remember the amazing speech by Martin Kimini, the permanent rep to the UN, about Ukraine. I mean, that was one of the more inspiring speeches that I think many of us have heard here, and very important to look at the text of that speech and to really process what he said. There's also countries like Singapore in Asia. And then we've had all of this debate here about colonialism and, kind of how to deal with the past. But there are in Europe quite a few countries, the Scandinavian countries, even Sweden, that have never established colonies in Africa or Asia. As you said, you had to slough off the Danes, and then at various points Sweden moved out, but you didn't get as far as Africa and Asia. And of course we have Estonia and the Baltic states, which have individually and collectively played very important roles in both the European Union and NATO in spurring action by the larger countries and then keeping them honest. And I want to then return and finish where I started off with Lennart Meri, whose wonderful smiling face we see here, because this is a Lennart Meri moment. We need the maneuverability of an Inuit kayak. We don't need the laborious turns of a supertanker or an encumbered superpower. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You may have now your well-deserved rest and coffee. Thank you.